All right, welcome to my session about JVM microframeworks. Firstly, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Jaap Coomans. I'm a Java developer. I live in Tilburg, that's near the south border of the Netherlands. I've been developing Java ever since 2002 and professionally since 2006. I work for a company called Group 9. We're a group of experienced Java developers and architects who mostly work for clients and in projects. And outside work, I'm a husband and a father of two girls. And I love to play board games. And to join the board game, I love to drink a nice glass of beer. But that's more than enough about me. So let's talk about microframeworks. Whenever I say the term microframework, the first response that I mostly get is, don't you mean microservices framework? And while most microframeworks are perfectly suitable to develop your microservice in, it's not necessarily the same. So I really mean microframework. So you might be wondering then, what actually is a microframework if it's not a microservices framework? So let's have a look at the definition, and I'll find that in my favorite source, Wikipedia. A microframework is a term used to refer to minimalistic web application frameworks. It is contrasted with full stack frameworks. Okay, so what did we learn here? Not a lot, actually. It's quite the broad definition. It must be an application framework, and it must not be a full stack framework. That's actually all it says. So, right, good for me. I can go any direction with this talk that I want, because I can fit in almost everything here. So good for me, but also not so good for me, because there's a lot of frameworks that now fit into this definition. So I have to cover a lot of ground. But in the end, this is a comparison about microframeworks. So I think I can make that work. So first, let's have a brief look at the history of microframeworks, at least JVM microframeworks. For that, it starts in 2009 with Scalatra and Jot. Then Redpack joins, Drop Wizard, Spark, and Play joins some later, Ninja. And then in 2014, 15, 16, it really gets wild. A lot of frameworks join the market. 2017 and 2018. And then it stopped, actually, or at least to my knowledge. The first time I did this talk was just before the pandemic hit us in 2020. And by then it wasn't really that surprising. 2019 was just over and no new additions. But yeah, I really tried to look up some new ones for this edition. I didn't find any. Maybe the pandemic had to do with it. I don't know. So that brings me to this list of 32 frameworks, which is clearly too long to cover. So I first went through the list to see if there are any candidates that can go right away. Well, first of all, there's JLHTTP. There's a GPL license, which I don't really like. But more importantly, it's on a custom hosting platform, whereas the other 31 are on GitHub. So that made it kind of shady for me. Then Jot is a set of microframeworks, at least that's what they call them themselves. And when I look at it, I would personally more call it a set of libraries. It's not really an application framework in the same sense as the others. It looks really nice, but I don't consider it to be a microframework, so that's off the list as well. Then KHTP is a dev project since 2017. Ninja framework is a self-proclaimed full stack framework. And if there's one thing we learned from the Wikipedia definition, that's in contrast with a microframework. The Play framework, it's a really cool framework, but it's not really micro in that sense anymore. So I scrapped that off the list. For that same reason, I scrapped Quarkus. Again, a really cool framework. I love Quarkus, but yeah, well, it only has micro startup times. It's a full-fledged framework, and by definition, it's not on the list. Then Rapidoid, I couldn't get any proper documentation for the current version, so I really couldn't get started with it. And lastly, Redkill. All docs are in Chinese, and my Chinese is a little rusty, so I had to scrap that. Maybe it's an awesome framework, but I just can't find out with documentation in Chinese. Now you might be wondering, why is my favorite framework not on your slides? Well, first of all, because I didn't hear about it, probably through whatever reason, but I'd love to hear about it. So if you have a framework that you're missing from this list, please contact me after the talk. I'd love to hear more about it. So now it's time to sort it all out. Let's start to see if we can group them. Is it possible to categorize them? And to help you throughout this presentation, you will see this opinionometer, and it will tell you whether what's to come are purely facts or purely my opinion or something in between. Right now, we're entering a section with mostly factual stuff. First thing I could think of is, can we group them by license? Because it's all open source. Maybe that gives an interesting picture. And then you see that the vast majority uses the Apache 2 license, which is a cool license in my opinion, both for creators and for users. There's a couple of BSD licenses, both 2 and 3 clause, and one MIT license, which is mostly similar to BSD. And lastly, there's John with LGPL. So not really a big differentiator here. Okay, let's move on. Maybe we can find some other category. Then more hands-on, the programming language. Of course, it's all JVM, but as we know, JVM supports multiple languages. So maybe there's a nice categorization in there. Most obviously support Java. And when I say support here, I mean it's a documented feature of the framework. Of course, you can make Ktor work with Java somehow. You don't want to, but it should be possible. Then there's Kotlin frameworks, HTTP4K and Ktor, and you also see some that support both Java and Kotlin. There's also some Groovy, and it may be no big surprise that Scalatra is a Scala framework. And the most interesting one I found, at least according to the documentation, Cumulus EE supports Node and Go. I didn't really dive into that because I found it a really interesting feature, especially because it's based on microprofile, but okay. So next, the programming model. And this is also what you get to experience when you start developing with the framework. Do you use annotations or not? And what kind of annotations would you use? So there's a couple that use microprofile, as earlier said, Cumulus EE, but also Hammock, Helidon, and Microwave. So they support a pretty well-known standard by now. Then there's quite a lot that use the programmatic model. That's my personal favorite. It's a model where you use an API to construct your application and your endpoints without annotations or stuff like that. So less magic, more programming. Doesn't mean that it's really a lot of programming in many cases. So that's roughly half of it. And to me, this is really micro frameworkish, but that's just my opinion. Then there's some that are based on custom annotations. There's, for instance, Micronaut that has its own annotations, which are inspired by Spring. So it makes it easy for Spring developers to switch over. And the others have their own. What you also see, maybe interesting to notice, is that Helidon supports both microprofile and a programmatic model, and does that by actually splitting itself in 2 frameworks. So there's Helidon microprofile and there's Helidon SE. So later in some other slides, you might see Helidon appear as 2 frameworks. Then there's a couple that are purely centered around JAX-RS, and Light4j is based on code generation, which makes it an interesting outlier here. because it's all open source, it's also interesting to see what organization is behind it, because that really has influence on how it's developed and where it goes. So there's quite a bunch, roughly half, that's backed by a company. And that ranges from smaller, less known companies to the object group for Micronaut and Oracle even for Helidon, JetBrains for Cater. More well-known companies with quite a track record. Whether it's good or bad, I leave that up to you to decide. Then to my surprise, it's only Microwave with a non-profit organization behind it. And then the rest falls into the category of what I call community. So there's either one committer behind it or a little group of committers, but they're not organized in a specific organization. So that, yeah, paints the picture a little bit that this is quite a niche market. And I think that's correct. More technical, you can sort them by web engine. Roughly half supports Jetty. Then there's some Tomcat. And you can immediately see here some also support multiple engines. If we add in Undertow, there's some more. There's some Netty. And then eventually there's the other flavors. There's some really interesting ones. Green Lightning, I couldn't find out. And notable here is Cater's own CIO, that then again is supported by HTTP4K. But this is, this is by far the most colorful picture of these categorizations. So can you categorize them by this? Not really. There's a lot of options in most cases. So enough categories. Let's try to see if we can measure something, because as a wise man once said, to measure is to know. So let's see, what can we know about it? Upcoming, purely facts. My first attempt was Google Trends, because Google Trends gives you nice graphs over time and gives us some idea about where it goes and what the trends are. But that didn't really work out. Many of these frameworks are very small, and some have names that also something else outside the tech industry. And that makes it really hard for Google Trends to make the distinction. Because, for instance, it doesn't know whether it's about a hammock in your backyard or a hammock on your PC. And that, just gives strange results. So I skipped that. What metrics did I then come up with? Well, first of all, there's the number of active contributors. How many people are actively contributing to the framework? I took a rather arbitrary stance on that by saying, okay, what's an active contributor? That's someone who made 20 commits or more over the last 2 years and touched 1,000 lines of code or more. It's completely arbitrary, but you have to get some number somewhere. Then also I had a look at the number of stars on GitHub, the number of questions on Stack Overflow, and the number of followers on Stack Overflow. So the people who follow a tag belonging to a framework there. Then these are the numbers that came out. So looking at the active contributors, Micronaut is the clear winner with 15. Then Helidon has 11. Some like Ameria and Cater are also pretty good with 5. And most notable is that these 4 I now mentioned that are the top are all backed by a company. So that tells you something about what effect it has if there's money behind something. And looking at the number of stars on GitHub, at the far right, there's Spark with more than 9,000 stars. That's pretty decent. And there's a couple of frameworks in the thousands, then a few with hundreds, and at the bottom there's a couple with tens, and John 10, to give you a little bit of an idea. Later on you will see I made a little demo project for this talk. I did this talk once before, and that project on GitHub has 7 stars alone, so that gives you a little bit of an idea what these low rankers are about. Then the number of questions on Stack Overflow. Yeah, I really had to put this on a logarithmic scale, so bear that in mind. A drop result is by far the winner with almost 2,000 questions. Then the next one is Micronaut with roughly half of that, a little more than 1,000. Then it goes into the hundreds for a couple, and the rest is not a lot. And quite some frameworks, they're not, you can't even find anything about them on Stack Overflow. So they're just absent. Then when you look at the number of followers, it's drop result. That's again the clear winner with more than 800 followers. So there's a lot of people interested in that. Then going down, Micronaut, Cator, Spark, there's quite some followers. And after that, it roughly goes down with even more on zero here. Then I indexed all these numbers. So the highest ranker for each category got 100 points and the rest relative to that. And then you get this picture. So you see Micronaut is pretty okay all around. Droppers is scoring a lot of points. Cator, Spark are notable. But also some are barely even there, like Green Lightning and Hammock. In terms of numbers, they're not doing well. And then I thought, okay, this ranks amongst each other. Let's bring in something just outside the range, like Spring Boot, which is not a microframework, but definitely a very well-known and very well adopted framework. So if we index it along that line, only the number of contributors really keeps up and the rest drops to the point of barely visible if you compare it to Spring Boot. So that also gives you, again, a little bit of an idea where this market is. It's quite niche. So the upcoming section has some room for debate, a little bit factual, a little bit my opinion. Based on the numbers, I picked these 15 for my slightly less long list. It's still quite long, but 15 is overseeable. And for this, I also found a nice tool to give you a little view of the development in number of GitHub stars over time. The link is at the bottom of the screen. Couldn't fit all 15 in one view, but this gives some nice insights. Like, for instance, here, Cator is really rising pretty steeply right now. Spark and drop results are flattening out. So these are the top ones. Then the smaller ones. Note this one goes to 3K in the previous slide, went to 8K, and it starts at a different time. But this also gives some interesting insights. Like Redback has been around for a long time, but it's really flattened out. But Armeria is rising a lot. Helidon even had almost vertical start and still rising a lot. HTTP 4K is definitely going up. So this gives some insight about where it's going. And what I did with these 15 is I created a to-do backend implementation for that. So if you're not familiar with to-do backend, maybe you're familiar with the slightly more well-known to-do MVC. That's the front-end variation. It's a project that gathers implementations of a really simple application that helps you to manage a to-do list. And by doing that in a central place, it gives a nice view of comparisons of different technologies. So I had a look at their test set and created my own little test suite for that and had it on to make it in to-do backend implementation for these 15 frameworks. So what did I learn from that? Well, first, what does it entail? It's 6 REST endpoints, mostly CRUD. There's some JSON serialization, obviously, involved. Most frameworks already have their own serialization, which is mostly Jackson. So where I had to bring it in myself, I opted for Jackson to get fair comparison. Then core support is a pretty big part of the test set, so I had to integrate that. Sometimes it comes out of the box in the framework, sometimes I had to build it myself. And for the rest, it's just a minimalistic setup. So there's no database or something else, no HTTPS, just very minimal. So what I then did is have a look at the size of the dependencies that are brought in for this implementation for each framework. And you see that it's really pretty well spread, ranging from the 4.8 megabytes in Spark, which is nice and small, to the 18.5 in Armeria, which is still not too big, but there's a clear difference. It's a factor 3 to 4 difference, and the rest is somewhere in between. Now, the size of the dependencies is interesting for deployment reasons, but the number of dependencies is also pretty interesting, because the less dependencies, the better, I would say, because you have less things that you have to keep an eye on for updating, for security reasons. And that paints quite a different picture. You see here, Helidon microprofile is the clear winner, or should I say loser here, with 143. And Blade at the other end is at 16, which is, well, that's almost factor 8 or 9 difference. And the rest is, well, mostly a little bit in between. Only Cumulus EE and drop versions are also near 100. But there's a really, really big difference here between the frameworks. And what is also interesting, maybe to note, I don't have it on slide here, but as said, I did this talk before the pandemic, and I updated the numbers with the latest versions, and it kind of dropped for all of them. So that's kind of good. Then the startup time, because, well, you want a micro framework to be fast, of course. What I did, I ran it on my own machine, and it has 16 gig of RAM, an i7 4-core processor. I'm using Docker Desktop, Windows 10, by the way. I used JDK 16 for almost all of them. Only Cumulus EE is on 15 because it doesn't support 16 yet. And I took the median of 5 stars. And then you come up with this. Cumulus EE is at roughly 2.5 seconds. Then Helidon microprofile is in the same area. And interesting here, like with the previous ones, Helidon SE, it's a way different range. It's at 0.5 second, so that the factor 5 difference. But the clear winner here is Cator. And again, here was actually quite some difference with roughly 15 months ago, where outside the difference in the framework, the only difference was that it's on JDK 13. It was the same machine that I used for that. And it all pretty much dropped. Only Cator was at 150, the rest was a bunch higher. And you see quite some are nearing Cator right now. Javelin, Blade, Spark, they're in the same area. So what changed during the pandemic? Well, on the left, you see the versions I used in January 2020. And on the right, you see the versions I used right now in May 21. And the green ones are where there was a major version upgrade. And in most cases, that also meant I really had to go through the upgrade guide and follow some steps to really go through the upgrade to make it work. For the others, I just could bump the version number and briefly check the documentation to see if there were any improvements I could leverage, for instance, core support being added or something like that. And the two orange ones, Blade and Pippo, they only got a minor and even a bug fix release. So these are, yeah, less vibrant right now. So next section, this is purely my opinion. So if you don't agree, that's possible. Please let me know if you have another opinion. I'd love to hear about it. So the winners, who are the winners of these 15? Of course, my winners. First of all, Javelin. And yeah, well, this is my personal favorite because for one, it's not too big and it has quite some traction and there's quite some committers. You can use both Java and Kotlin, hence the name Javelin is actually a contraction of these both. And it's pretty fast as well. So it has something good in every category, pretty much appealing to me. I actually used it for one of my projects. Then if you're more into Kotlin, then Ktor is your thing because you can do Kotlin in quite some frameworks, but Ktor really is, yeah, it's also JetBrains. So that makes sense. Really does all the things in the Kotlin way. So if you're really into Kotlin, Ktor is a really cool framework. And as you saw, it's blazing fast. That's really awesome. I can't get around drop wizards. Just purely on the number section, drop wizard is clearly the high roller right now. Maybe a little bit on its return, but well, you can find a lot of resources about it. It's pretty well documented, so it's quite a safe bet. Micronaut also based on quite some good numbers, but also because I see there's quite some buzz about it. The cool thing is if you're experienced with Spring, it's pretty easy to go to Micronaut. So if you're into that, that's a good choice. And lastly, I personally like Helidon SE as well. It's not really one of the biggest ones, but I like the programmatic model that they have, and it's Oracle behind it. That might be a bad thing from one side, but also there's a lot of money there. So the likelihood that it's a framework that will survive is quite big if they don't pull the plug at some point, at least. That is. Some of my personal takeaways of doing this exercise. First of all, the surprising one, Maven archetypes are not dead. I thought they were dead and buried and no one used them anymore, but going through the getting started manuals of all these frameworks, I learned that quite a lot. Start with just run this Maven archetype. And that was a surprise to me. But also, as mentioned before, micro also means micro adoption in this case. It's really a niche part of the market. There's some that are bigger, but they're also in the shady area where I'm playing a little bit around with the definition. If you really take the core micro frameworks, there's not a lot of adoption. And for that reason, also think before you choose. Look carefully at what you have. The license and the usage all play a role. Of course, the technical aspects are interesting, but as usual, it depends. And take in all the factors that matter when you choose a technology. And with that, we've reached the end of my talk. I'd like to thank you for your attention. Please help me improving on my story and my speaking skills. So reach out to me. I have my Twitter handle here. You can get the code of the to-do backends that I created. It was too little time to really share it during the presentation, but you can get it on GitHub. Please find it there. And they're in there, all 15. And thank you for your time and your attention. So let's head on with the Q&A. I'd love to hear your questions.